You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 7,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's dive into today's story. The rain hammered against the narrow windows of Father Dominic Castellano's office like skeletal fingers demanding entry, each drop striking the ancient glass with a persistence that spoke of storms older than memory. At 38, he had grown accustomed to working through Rome's violent autumn tempests, finding something oddly comforting in their chaos while he pored over manuscripts that most Vatican scholars wouldn't dare to open. His cramped quarters in the deepest level of the secret archives were a scholar's paradise and nightmare combined. Books bound in cracked leather lined every surface from floor to ceiling, their pages yellowed with age and heavy with secrets that predated Christ himself. The office existed in a state of controlled chaos that only Dominic understood. Towers of ancient texts created narrow pathways between his desk and the single bookshelf that held his most precious volumes. Grimoires written in languages that had died with their civilizations. Theological treatises that questioned the very nature of reality, and correspondence from long-dead Vatican exorcists whose final letters spoke of things that shouldn't exist. The air carried the perpetual scent of old parchment, candle wax, and something else, something organic and unsettling that seemed to emanate from the oldest texts. It was past midnight when Cardinal Rossetti found him there, surrounded by towers of forbidden knowledge and the guttering light of a solitary desk lamp. The Cardinal's usually immaculate appearance was dishevelled in a way that sent immediate alarm through Dominic's scholarly mind. His silver hair was wild, as if he'd been running his hands through it for hours. Dark circles shadowed his eyes like bruises, and his pristine scarlet robes bore the wrinkles of someone who hadn't slept in days. "Father Castellano," he said without preamble, his voice carrying a tremor that Dominic had never heard before. The Cardinal's hands shook slightly as he spoke, and his skin had taken on a waxy pallor that suggested either illness or terror. "We have received word of a discovery that threatens everything we hold sacred." The Cardinal placed a thick manila envelope on the desk with reverent care, as if it contained something that might explode if handled roughly. The papal seal gleamed like a drop of blood in the lamplight, but there was something wrong with it. The wax was too dark, almost black, and it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Dominic carefully broke the seal, noting how the wax crumbled to ash at his touch, and examined the contents. Photographs spilled across his desk in a cascade of impossible images. They showed a stone chamber carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift, even in still photography, as if the very act of capturing them had somehow failed to contain their essential nature. The stonework was impossibly ancient, predating any known civilization by millennia, yet the craftsmanship was perfect, too perfect, as if it had been carved by hands that understood geometry on a level beyond human comprehension. But it was the final photograph that made his breath catch in his throat, an archway that seemed to lead not into another room, but into absolute nothingness. The darkness beyond the threshold was so complete that it hurt to look at, not because it was too bright, but because it was too empty, a void that seemed to pull at something deep in the observer's soul. 3 days ago, Cardinal Rossetti began, settling heavily into the chair across from Dominic's desk, his movements those of a man decades older than his actual years. Archaeological teams excavating beneath the ruins of Kilmarie Cathedral in the Scottish Highlands broke through into a chamber that, according to every geological survey and historical record, should not exist. The Cardinal paused studying Dominic's reaction with eyes that seemed haunted by visions he couldn't share. The initial survey team consisted of 4 experienced archaeologists. They emerged after only 20 minutes, babbling about voices in the darkness and creatures made of light. 2 of them were immediately committed to psychiatric care. The other 2, they haven't stopped drawing. Drawing? Dominic asked, though some instinct told him he didn't want to know the answer. Symbols, geometric patterns that hurt to look at. They draw them compulsively, covering every available surface, and when they run out of paper, they draw them on the walls, on their own skin. The doctors had to restrain them to prevent further self-injury. The Cardinal reached into his robes and produced a sketch pad, its pages filled with drawings that made Dominic's eyes water just a glimpse. The symbols seemed to move and shift when viewed peripherally, creating optical illusions that suggested dimensions beyond the 3 that human minds could process. The second team lasted 3 hours before they too fled in terror, Cardinal Rossetti continued, closing the sketch pad with obvious relief. But it was the third team that confirmed our worst fears. They found inscriptions, Father. Inscriptions in languages that died out before recorded history began, but which somehow they could read as clearly as their native tongue. The knowledge simply appeared in their minds, as if the symbols themselves were imprinting their meaning directly onto human consciousness. Dominic set down the photographs with hands that trembled despite his efforts to maintain composure. What did the inscriptions say? They spoke of the threshold of the eternal, Cardinal Rossetti whispered, the words seeming to hang in the air like a curse that might take physical form. A gateway between our world and realms that exist beyond human comprehension, a bridge across dimensions that was sealed long ago by guardians whose names have been forgotten by history. The Cardinal's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But Father, the seal is weakening. The workers who discovered it have been experiencing violent nightmares that leave them catatonic. They describe dreams of walking through impossible landscapes populated by beings whose beauty is so intense it drives observers mad. The livestock throughout the entire valley have been found arranged in geometric patterns around the site, their eyes rolled back white, still alive but completely unresponsive to external stimuli. Cardinal Rossetti reached into his robes and produced a leather-bound tome that looked older than the Vatican itself. The book was massive, easily 6 inches thick, and bound in leather that had been dyed a deep crimson that seemed to shift and change in the lamplight. Strange symbols were burned into its cover, marks that appeared to have been made with instrument that operated on principles beyond current human understanding. More disturbing still is the sound, the Cardinal continued, his voice now barely audible, a humming that emanates from deep within the earth, growing stronger each night. The local authorities have evacuated a 10-mile radius, but we fear it may already be too late to contain what has been unleashed. Satellite imagery shows that the surrounding forest is dying, not gradually but all at once, as if life itself is being drained from the land. Dominic accepted the ancient book with hands that had suddenly gone cold. The leather binding was worn smooth by countless fingers, and when he touched it, he felt a slight electrical sensation, as if the book itself possessed some form of rudimentary consciousness. When he opened it, the parchment pages released a scent, like incense mixed with something else, something organic and unsettling that reminded him of hospitals and funeral homes. This manuscript was recovered from the Knights Templar archives before their suppression in 1307, Cardinal Rossetti explained, his voice gaining strength as he focused on historical facts rather than current horrors. It contains protocols that have been followed for over 1,000 years, safeguards put in place by those who understood the true nature of what lies beyond the veil of our reality. The Templars weren't just warrior monks, Father. They were guardians, standing watch at threshold sites, across the known world. Dominic's eyes scanned the opening passages, written in Latin so archaic that he had to puzzle out the meaning word by word. The text was illuminated with intricate marginalia that depicted scenes of cosmic horror barely contained within religious symbolism. Angels with too many eyes and wings that bent in directions that shouldn't exist. Saints whose halos were actually geometric patterns that hurt to examine closely, and always the recurring image of doorways that led to spaces filled with stars that formed constellations in patterns that human astronomers had never catalogued. "You want me to seal the gateway?" Dominic said, looking up at the Cardinal. "You are the only one qualified for such a task," Cardinal Rossetti replied, leaning forward with desperate intensity. "Your expertise in pre-Christian texts, your knowledge of forbidden rituals, your proven ability to maintain faith in the face of the impossible. Father Castellano, if this gateway remains open, if what lies beyond is allowed to enter our world, it could mean the end of everything we have fought to protect for 2 millennia." The Cardinal stood, his movements stiff with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "I have arranged for your immediate departure. Brother Alistair MacLeod will meet you in Edinburgh. He's the local priest and knows the folklore of the region. The site has been declared off-limits by both the British government and the Church, but your credentials will grant you access." That night, Dominic dismissed sleep entirely and devoted himself to studying the manuscript. The text revealed a history that challenged everything he thought he knew about the Church's origins and purpose. According to the ancient writings, Christianity had been built not just on the foundation of Christ's teachings, but as a conscious response to knowledge that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that most of our cosmic neighbours were not benevolent. The book spoke of 5 sacred laws that had been observed by guardians across different cultures and religions for thousands of years. These were not mere suggestions, but absolute commandments, written in the blood of those who had learned their importance through terrible experience. Each law was accompanied by detailed accounts of what had befallen those who ignored them. Testimonies that read like the ravings of madmen, but which were corroborated by too many independent sources to dismiss. The first law was explicit in its warning. Never approach the threshold during the new moon, when the barriers between worlds grew thin and malevolent influences could seep through the cracks in reality, like poison through a wound. The manuscript described in horrifying detail what had befallen a group of Benedictine monks who had ignored this rule in 847 AD. Their bodies were found days later arranged in a perfect spiral around the threshold site, drained of all life force, but with expressions of such transcendent joy on their faces that several investigators were driven to suicide by the sight. The second law demanded that only objects blessed by holy water from multiple sacred sites be brought near the threshold. Unhallowed items, the text explained in clinical detail, would become conduits for entities hungry to taste the material world. Weapons would turn against their wielders, tools would malfunction at critical moments, and even simple objects like coins or buttons could become focal points for possession. The book included a detailed account from a French crusader who had brought an unlucky charm to a threshold site in the Holy Land, only to watch it transform into something that defied description and consumed 3 of his companions before it could be destroyed. The third law chilled Dominic most deeply. Maintain absolute mental discipline and never speak aloud any thoughts of fear, doubt, or despair. The manuscript detailed how negative emotions resonated across dimensional boundaries, drawing the attention of beings that fed upon human suffering, like sharks drawn to blood in the water. Once such entities focused their attention on a guardian, the text warned, death was often preferable to what followed. A Venetian priest's account from 1453 described how a single spoken word of doubt had attracted something from beyond the threshold that had stalked him for 7 years. feeding on his sanity, piece by piece, until he finally threw himself from the Campanile di San Marco to escape its attention. The fourth law outlined the warning signs that indicated the threshold was becoming unstable. Sudden temperature drops that could freeze a man's breath in midsummer, animals fleeing the area en masse as if driven by invisible predators, and most ominously, the overwhelming sensation of being watched by eyes that existed in dimensions beyond human perception. Should these signs manifest, immediate retreat was not just advisable, but essential for survival. The book contained testimony from a Spanish inquisitor who had ignored these warnings at a site near Toledo, resulting in the complete disappearance of an entire village and the creation of a dead zone where nothing would grow for 3 centuries. But it was the fifth law that made Dominic's hands tremble as he read. Under no circumstances should any entity from beyond the threshold be permitted to cross into our world, regardless of how divine, benevolent, or beautiful it might appear. The manuscript included testimonies from guardians who had failed this test, their final words describing beings of impossible beauty who had seemed like angels but had brought nothing but corruption and madness in their wake. A Byzantine priest's account from 1071 told of an entity so beautiful that merely looking upon it had driven an entire monastery to commit acts of such depravity that the church had been forced to burn the building and declare the ground cursed. Each law was accompanied by ritual instructions in multiple languages, procedures that had been refined over centuries of tragic trial and error. The sealing ceremony itself was described in excruciating detail, a complex ritual that required perfect execution and absolute faith. A single mispronounced syllable, a moment's hesitation, or the smallest crack in the guardian's resolve could result in failure, and failure meant worse than death. As dawn broke over Rome, Dominic closed the manuscript and prepared for his journey. He packed carefully, selecting items that had been blessed by multiple popes and saints, a crucifix carved from wood and taken from the true cross, holy water from the Jordan River collected on Easter Sunday, candles made from beeswax blessed at the tomb of St. Peter, and a collection of religious medallions that had been worn by martyrs and saints throughout church history. The flight to Edinburgh passed in a haze of grey clouds and churning thoughts. Dominic found himself obsessively reviewing the manuscript's warnings, committing every detail to memory. He was acutely aware that once the sealing ritual was complete, the protective amnesia described in the text would begin to take effect. This journey to Scotland might be the last time he would remember the full scope of what he was facing. Brother Alistair MacLeod met him at the airport, a weathered man in his 50s whose kind eyes couldn't quite hide the deep fear that lurked beneath the surface. His thick Scottish accent carried the weight of generations who had lived in the shadow of something they didn't understand, but instinctively feared. He was tall and lean, with the calloused hands of someone who had spent years doing manual labour alongside his priestly duties, and there was a steadiness about him that Dominic found immediately reassuring. "Father Castellano," Alistair said, gripping Dominic's hand with surprising strength. "I've been the parish priest in Glenmorrigan for 23 years. My grandfather was the priest before me, and his father before him. For 4 generations my family has watched over this valley, and we've all heard the stories." As they drove through the increasingly desolate Highland countryside, Alistair shared the local folklore that had been passed down through his family. The stories painted a picture of a land that had been wounded long before human memory began, a place where the barriers between worlds had always been thin. The old cathedral was built in the 12th century by monks who claimed they were following a divine vision, Alistair explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper as they navigated winding mountain roads. But the local records, the ones that survived the various wars and burnings, suggest they were actually trying to contain something that was already there. They built the cathedral not as a place of worship, but as a prison. The landscape grew more barren as they travelled north, the lush green hills giving way to moorland that seemed drained of colour and life. Ancient standing stones dotted the countryside like grave markers, their surfaces carved with symbols that made Dominic's eyes water when he tried to focus on them. The stones were arranged in patterns that suggested some vast geometric design, spanning miles, as if the entire region was part of some incomprehensible ritual circle. "Those stones are older than any human settlement in Scotland," Alistair continued, noticing Dominic's interest. "Archaeological dating puts them at over 8,000 years old, but the symbols carved on them, they don't match any known ancient language. Sometimes when the light hits them just right, you can see other markings underneath, symbols that seem to shift and change depending on the angle of observation." As they crested a particularly steep hill, Dominic saw their destination in the distance. The ruins of Kilmarie Cathedral stood like broken teeth against the darkening sky, its Gothic arches collapsed and its walls crumbling after centuries of abandonment. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the very air around it, a quality that made the eye want to slide away and focus on anything else. The building seemed to exist in a pocket of space that operated by different rules, where perspective didn't quite work the way it should, and shadows fell in directions that defied the position of the sun. "No one has lived within 5 miles of this place for over a century," Alistair said, pulling the car to a stop at the base of the hill. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. "The soil won't grow anything, despite being rich and dark everywhere else in the valley. Livestock that graze too near are found days later, wandering in circles, their eyes clouded white, and their behaviour permanently altered. And the dreams, Father. Anyone who sleeps within sight of those ruins has dreams that drive them to madness." They climbed the winding path on foot, their boots crunching on gravel that seemed unnaturally cold, even in the mild October weather. Dominic noticed immediately that the usual sounds of the countryside, the birds and insects that should have filled the air with their chatter, gradually faded to an unnatural silence that pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. By the time they reached the ruins, the only sound was the wind whistling through the broken stones, and even that seemed muffled and distant, as if the air itself was reluctant to carry sound in this place. The archaeological dig had been hastily abandoned, equipment scattered around a gaping hole in what had once been the cathedral's nave, like the remnants of a battlefield. Yellow police tape fluttered in the breeze like prayer flags, and hastily erected barriers surrounded the excavation site. The very air around the dig seemed to shimmer with heat despite the cool temperature, and Dominic could see that the grass within a 20-foot radius of the opening had turned brown and brittle, as if exposed to intense radiation. "They found it 4 days ago," Alistair explained, crossing himself as they approached the edge of the excavation. His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. A hidden entrance beneath the altar stone that their ground-penetrating radar had somehow missed. Strange thing is, when they reviewed the earlier scans, the cavity was clearly visible. It was as if it had simply chosen not to be noticed until the proper time. Alistair's face grew pale as he continued. The first man down those steps, Donald Mackenzie, had been working archaeological digs for over 20 years. He was known for his steady nerves and practical mind. He came back up screaming about beautiful voices calling to him from the depths, promising him knowledge that would make him as the angels. He hasn't spoken a coherent word since. They have him sedated at the hospital in Inverness, but even in his drugged sleep he tries to dig through the walls with his fingernails. Dominic peered into the opening and saw ancient stone steps descending into absolute darkness. The walls were carved with the same symbols he had seen in the photographs, but experiencing them in person was entirely different from viewing their images. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and looking at them too long made his vision blur and his head pound with a pressure that felt like something trying to claw its way into his skull. Worse, the symbols seemed to be trying to communicate, pressing meaning directly into his consciousness in a way that bypassed his normal cognitive processes. The second team made it further. Alistair continued, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. 3 experienced archaeologists and a structural engineer. They described a vast chamber with an archway that led to nowhere. But when they tried to take photographs, their equipment malfunctioned in ways that defied explanation. Digital cameras captured only static. Film cameras produced images of things that weren't there. Audio recordings contained nothing but screaming in languages that don't exist, and their flashlights dimmed as if the darkness itself was consuming the light. The engineer, Alistair explained, had been the most badly affected. He had approached the archway with his instruments, trying to take measurements and readings. When his companions found him 20 minutes later, he was standing perfectly still, staring into the void beyond the threshold. His instruments had been arranged in a perfect geometric pattern around his feet, and he was speaking in a constant whisper. Not words, but numbers. Mathematical formulas that describe geometric relationships in 11 dimensions. Equations that shouldn't have been comprehensible to the human mind. They managed to get him out, Alistair said, but he's been committed to the same facility as Mackenzie. The doctors say he's catatonic, but the orderlies report that he still whispers those numbers, even in his sleep. And sometimes other patients start whispering them too, even though they've had no contact with him. As the sun set behind the Highland peaks, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the ruined cathedral like grasping fingers, they made their preparations. Dominic had brought sacred items from Rome, holy water collected from 7 different springs, each blessed by a different saint during their lifetime. Candles that had been lit at the tomb of St. Peter and extinguished only when their wax had been permanently infused with sacred flame, and a collection of religious medallions that had been consecrated by 3 different popes over the course of 2 centuries. Alistair had his own contributions. Water from St. Andrew's Well that had been blessed during midnight mass on Easter Sunday, a crucifix carved from olive wood taken from the Mount of Olives and carried by his grandfather during the Great War, and a leather satchel filled with salt that had been harvested from the Dead Sea and consecrated by the Archbishop of Canterbury himself. Each item had been chosen not just for its sacred nature, but for its connection to sites of genuine spiritual power. The manuscript is very specific about what we can bring, Dominic said, arranging the blessed items in his backpack with careful precision. Everything must be consecrated, everything must serve the light. A single unhallowed object could provide a foothold for the entities beyond the threshold, a way for them to manifest in our reality. As they prepared to descend, Dominic noticed that the temperature around the excavation site was dropping rapidly. Their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the metal equipment, despite the fact that moments before the evening had been mild. The change was so dramatic that it seemed less like natural weather, and more like the approach of something that carried winter in its wake. "It knows we're here," Alistair whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the crucifix around his neck. The silver medal was growing warm against his chest, a phenomenon that Dominic recognized from the manuscript's descriptions of proximity to threshold sites. They descended into the earth carrying blessed candles that provided the only light in the suffocating darkness. The flame of each candle burned with an unusual steadiness, as if protected by some force that kept the air perfectly still around them. The temperature dropped dramatically with each step, and soon they were walking through air so cold it burned their lungs with every breath and made their extremities numb, despite their thick clothing. The stone walls pressed in around them, carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the flickering candlelight. The markings were arranged in complex patterns that suggested mathematical relationships, but mathematics based on principles that human science had never discovered. When Dominic tried to trace the patterns with his eyes, Following their intricate pathways, he found himself becoming dizzy and disoriented, as if his mind was trying to process spatial relationships that existed in dimensions his brain couldn't accommodate. "The symbols," Alistair whispered, after they had been walking for what felt like hours. "I can almost read them. It's as if they're speaking directly to my mind, but in a language I've never learned. They're trying to tell me something about the nature of space and time, about how reality is constructed. But every time I think I'm beginning to understand, the meaning slips away like water through my fingers." "Don't try to understand them," Dominic warned, remembering the manuscript's detailed warnings about the corrupting influence of pre-human knowledge. Some things are not meant for mortal comprehension. The very act of understanding them changes us in ways that make us less human. The stairway seemed to descend far deeper than should have been possible, spiraling down through layers of rock that had been undisturbed since the world was young. Geological striations in the walls showed that they were passing through stone that was millions of years old, yet the carved symbols appeared on every level, as if they had been created before the rock itself had solidified. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing against them like a living thing, and both men found their breathing becoming laboured despite the slow pace of their descent. It was then that they first heard the singing. The sound was barely audible at first, like voices carried on a distant wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. But as they continued downward, it grew stronger and more distinct. It was beautiful beyond description, like a choir of angels performing harmonies that touched something deep in the human soul, melodies that seemed to resonate with the very structure of their bones. The music was complex beyond human composition, layers upon layers of voices weaving together, in harmonies that shouldn't have been possible for any earthly choir to achieve. "Dear God," Alistair breathed, tears streaming down his cheeks as the celestial music washed over them. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. It's like hearing the voice of creation itself." Dominic felt the same overwhelming response to the ethereal music, a joy so intense it was almost painful. Every fibre of his being wanted to abandon their mission and follow the sound to its source, to lose himself in that perfect harmony and never return to the mundane world above. But the manuscript's warnings echoed in his mind like a tolling bell. Beauty, it had cautioned, was often the most dangerous trap laid by entities from beyond the threshold. The more perfect something appeared, the more likely it was to be a lure designed to draw the unwary to their doom. "We must resist," he said, though his own voice cracked with the effort of speaking against the pull of that celestial chorus. "Remember the laws, remember why we're here, remember what happens to those who follow such songs to their source." The manuscript had been explicit about this particular danger. The singing was not merely beautiful, it was a form of psychic communication, a way for entities from beyond the threshold to implant ideas and desires directly into human consciousness. Those who listened too long would find their own thoughts being slowly replaced by alien concepts, their humanity gradually stripped away until nothing remained but an empty vessel singing in harmony with forces that regarded mortal life as nothing more than raw material for their cosmic compositions. The stairway finally opened into a vast underground cathedral that stretched far beyond the reach of their candlelight. The space was so enormous that their voices echoed for long seconds before fading into silence, suggesting dimensions that defied the physics of the world above. The walls soared upward into darkness so complete it seemed solid, and the floor was covered in intricate mosaics that depicted scenes of beings ascending to realms of pure light. The artwork was impossibly detailed, showing creatures of such transcendent beauty that looking at them directly caused physical pain. The mosaics seemed to move and shift when viewed peripherally, as if they were not static images but windows into living realms where entities of pure thought danced to music that could drive mortals mad with joy. The colours used in the artwork didn't correspond to any pigments known to human science. shades that seemed to exist between the normal spectrum of visible light. At the far end of the chamber stood a massive archway carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The archway was easily 20 feet tall and 15 feet wide, its surface polished to a mirror-like finish that showed no reflection of the two priests who approached it. The stone was not merely black but seemed to exist in a state of anti-light, a substance that devoured photons like a living thing feeding on illumination. As they drew closer to the archway, Dominic felt the religious medallion around his neck growing uncomfortably warm against his chest. The metal was heating up as if exposed to an intense energy source, and the pain was becoming difficult to ignore. The singing was louder here, no longer distant but seeming to emanate from the very stones around them. The melody was so complex and overwhelming that it took physical effort to think coherent thoughts while exposed to it. Through the archway they could see what appeared to be infinite space, a void that was occasionally illuminated by brilliant flashes of light that revealed glimpses of otherworldly landscapes. Dominic caught sight of towering spires that seemed to be constructed from crystallized music, structures that sang with their own inner voice and cast shadows that fell upward rather than down. He saw gardens where flowers bloomed within a radiance that put the sun to shame, their petals opening to reveal geometric patterns that described mathematical relationships in dimensions beyond human comprehension. And he saw the cities, vast metropolises populated by beings whose beauty was so intense it left after images burned into his retinas. The entities moved through spaces that existed beyond normal geometry, walking on surfaces that were simultaneously horizontal and vertical, breathing atmosphere that was composed of liquid light and crystallized thought. They were humanoid in basic shape, but perfect in ways that humans could never achieve, as if they were living embodiments of mathematical ideals rather than beings of flesh and blood. "This is it," Dominic whispered, opening the ancient manuscript with trembling hands. The threshold of the eternal. The ritual of sealing was written in Latin so archaic that Dominic had to puzzle out each phrase, but as he began to chant, the words seemed to flow from his lips with a fluency he didn't possess. The ancient syllables felt heavy on his tongue, each one requiring tremendous effort to speak, as if the very air was resisting his attempts to voice them. The words themselves seemed to have physical weight, pressing against his vocal cords and making each phrase an act of will, rather than simple speech. As the ritual progressed, Alistair created a protective circle around them, using the blessed salt from the Dead Sea. The white crystals formed intricate patterns on the dark stone floor, creating geometric designs that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The salt hissed and sparked where it touched the ancient stones, as if the very rock was hostile to its presence. The protective circle was not merely symbolic, but functional, creating a barrier that entities from beyond the threshold could not cross. The singing beyond the threshold grew louder and more insistent as Dominic continued the ritual. The flashes of light became more frequent, and he could see movement in the depths of that other worldly space. Graceful figures that seemed to be made of pure radiance were moving through realms that existed beyond human comprehension, and they appeared to be approaching the archway with increasing urgency. It was then that one of them crossed the boundary between dimensions and stepped to the very edge of their world. The being was tall and luminous, its form shifting constantly between human and something far more magnificent. It appeared to be composed of living light that took on the rough shape of a perfect human form, but details were impossible to focus on. When Dominic tried to look directly at it, his eyes watered and his vision blurred, but in his peripheral vision he could see that it was beautiful beyond description, possessed of a perfection that made every human he had ever seen seem like a crude approximation. The entity radiated warmth and peace on a level that transcended physical sensation. Simply being in its presence filled Dominic with a sense of completion and joy so intense that he wanted to weep with gratitude. This was what he had spent his life searching for without knowing it. The presence of the divine made manifest. The answer to every prayer he had ever whispered in the darkness of doubt. When the entity spoke, its voice was like celestial music given form, resonating not through the air but directly in their minds. The sound bypassed their ears entirely and spoke to something deeper, something that existed at the very core of their souls. Each word carried with it layers of meaning that human language could never convey, concepts that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal thought. "Faithful servants of the light," the being said, and its words carried with them a sense of peace and joy so intense that both priests fell to their knees, weeping. The entity's voice was everything they had imagined the voice of God might sound like, infinite in its compassion, overwhelming in its love, perfect in its understanding of their deepest needs and fears. "Why do you seek to close this sacred passage?" the entity continued, its luminous form stepping closer to the threshold. "I have come bearing gifts of divine knowledge, wisdom that could elevate your entire species to heights beyond imagination. I offer you understanding of the true nature of creation, insight into the cosmic purpose that guides all existence." Every fibre of Dominic's being urged him to trust this radiant creature. It appeared to be everything he had devoted his life to serving. A messenger from the divine realm, an angel offering sacred knowledge to humanity. The temptation to step aside and allow it passage was overwhelming, crushing, irresistible. This was why he had become a priest, why he had spent decades studying forbidden texts and searching for truth in the darkness of ancient mysteries. "I can show you the mathematics of creation," the entity continued, its voice growing more persuasive with each word. "I can reveal the geometric principles that underlie all existence, the sacred formulas that govern the dance of galaxies and the structure of atoms. I can grant you understanding that would make you as gods among your fellow mortals, capable of reshaping reality according to your will." Alistair was openly weeping now, his hands clasped in prayer as he gazed up at the magnificent being. "It's an angel," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and desperate longing. "A true messenger from heaven. How can we deny such a gift? How can we refuse knowledge that could end human suffering and bring paradise to earth?" The entity's form brightened, and Dominic could see what appeared to be wings of pure light unfurling from its shoulders. It was the most beautiful sight he had ever witnessed, more perfect than any religious artwork had ever imagined. This was what the saints had seen in their visions, what the martyrs had died believing in, what every believer had hoped to encounter in their moments of deepest faith. "You have been faithful servants," the entity said, its voice now carrying harmonics that made their bones vibrate with sympathy. "You have devoted your lives to seeking truth, and I am here to reward that devotion. I offer you not just knowledge but transformation. Step aside, allow me passage, and I will make you instruments of divine will. You will become more than human, elevated to serve as my priests in the new age that is coming." But even as his heart sang with joy at the sight of what appeared to be divine revelation made manifest, Dominic forced himself to remember the fifth law. No matter how divine, peaceful, or beneficial any entity from beyond may appear, it must never be allowed to cross into our world. The manuscript had been explicit in its warnings about this moment. The most dangerous entities were not the obviously malevolent ones, but those that appeared as angels of light. They would offer knowledge, power, enlightenment, anything that would convince a guardian to step aside and allow them passage. But behind their beautiful facades lurked corruption that could destroy not just individuals, but entire civilizations. Dominic thought of the testimonies he had read, accounts from guardians throughout history who had faced similar temptations. A Byzantine priest who had allowed what appeared to be an angel to cross the threshold only to watch it transform an entire monastery into something that still haunted the nightmares of historians. A French crusader who had been offered divine knowledge, and had accepted becoming the focal point for a plague of madness that had consumed 3 villages before being contained by the Inquisition. "I'm sorry," Dominic said, his voice cracking with the effort of refusing what appeared to be a divine messenger. "The ancient laws must be observed. I cannot allow you to pass." The entity's expression shifted slightly, and for just a moment Dominic glimpsed something behind its beautiful facade that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was only for an instant, barely perceptible, but in that flash he saw hunger, malice, and an alien intelligence that regarded humanity as little more than livestock to be harvested. The perfect features flickered like a mask slipping, revealing something underneath that his mind couldn't fully process, but that filled him with primal terror. Then the angelic mask slipped back into place, and the being smiled with radiance that could have powered the sun. "You misunderstand the nature of your duty, faithful one. I am not some demon seeking to corrupt your world. I am a messenger of the Most High, sent to bring enlightenment to those ready to receive it." The entity stepped closer to the threshold, and Dominic could feel the temperature in the chamber rising dramatically. The very air began to shimmer with heat, making their vision waver as if they were looking through the water. The ancient stones beneath their feet started to crack and groan under some invisible pressure, and the protective circle of salt began to smoke and hiss as if exposed to acid. "Look upon me truly," the being commanded, its voice taking on harmonics that made their skulls vibrate painfully. "See me as I really am, and know that I speak truth. I am what your species has always aspired to become. Perfect, eternal, free from the limitations of flesh and the boundaries of mortality." Against his will, Dominic found his gaze drawn upward to meet the entity's eyes. What he saw there defied description and challenged his sanity. They were not eyes at all, but windows into realms of such alien beauty that his consciousness recoiled from the sight. He saw cities of crystal and flame, where beings of impossible geometry danced to music that could drive mortals mad with joy. Oceans of liquid light that reflected stars from dimensions that had never known the touch of darkness. Forests where the trees were living equations and the flowers bloomed in mathematical sequences that described the fundamental structure of reality. And at the center of it all he glimpsed the entity's true nature, a hunger so vast and ancient that it made the being's beautiful form seem like nothing more than bait on a cosmic hook. It was desire incarnate, need given form and consciousness, want elevated to the level of fundamental force. It hungered not just for physical sustenance, but for the essence of consciousness itself, for the spark of individuality that made each human soul unique. "You see," the being whispered, its voice now carrying undertones of something vast and predatory. "You see the glory that awaits. You see the perfection that could be yours. Step aside, faithful one. Allow me to bring this gift to your world. Let me share with humanity the ecstasy of dissolution, the joy of becoming part of something infinitely greater than their small, individual existences." But Dominic had also seen something else in that alien vista. The remains of other worlds, other civilizations that had accepted such gifts. Planets reduced to lifeless husks, their populations transformed into something that was no longer remotely recognizable as the species they had once been. Entire solar systems where the stars themselves had been rearranged into geometric patterns that served purposes beyond mortal comprehension, all in service to entities whose true nature was so far beyond human understanding that madness was the only response to genuine contact. He saw the fate that awaited Earth if he stepped aside. Billions of humans transformed into components of some vast living organism that existed partially in their dimension, and partially in realms where thought was substance and desire was law. Humanity would not be destroyed but absorbed, integrated into something that regarded individual consciousness as merely raw material for larger patterns. "No," Dominic said, his voice growing stronger with each word as he drew upon reserves of faith he hadn't known he possessed. "I know what you are. I know what you offer, and I refuse." The entity's beautiful mask finally slipped away entirely, revealing something that existed beyond the boundaries of sanity. The form that had appeared angelic was nothing more than a crude approximation, a shape designed to appeal to human expectations of divine beauty. What stood before them now was geometry given malevolent life, angles that existed in dimensions human minds couldn't process, colours that had no names because they had never been seen by mortal eyes except in the moment before madness claimed those unfortunate enough to witness them. The being's true form was vast, extending far beyond the physical boundaries of the chamber into spaces that existed perpendicular to normal reality. It was simultaneously microscopic and cosmic, a fractal entity that contained infinite complexity within finite boundaries. Looking at it was like trying to perceive a four-dimensional object with three-dimensional vision. The mind could only grasp fragments, and those fragments were enough to drive observers to the edge of sanity. "Then you choose ignorance," it said, its voice now a harmony of screams that seemed to come from the throats of every soul that had ever suffered. The sound was not merely heard, but felt, vibrating through their bones and causing their teeth to ache with sympathetic resonance. "You choose to keep your species trapped in the prison of flesh and mortality, confined to this single dimension, when infinite realms of experience await beyond the threshold." The entity's form began to expand, pressing against the boundaries of the archway like water forcing its way through a crack in a dam. The stone around the threshold began to glow with heat as the being's presence tested the ancient barriers that held it back. Cracks appeared in the rock, spreading outward in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "But know this, Guardian," the entity continued, its voice causing the protective circle of salt to burst into flames that burned without consuming. "I am patient. I am eternal. Other gateways will open. Other guardians will prove less resolute. What you refuse today, others will accept tomorrow. The barriers weaken with each passing century, and eventually, inevitably, one will fail." As Dominic completed the final words of the sealing ritual, his voice rising to a shout to be heard over the entity's terrible screaming, the archway began to fill with a substance that looked like liquid marble. The material flowed upward from the base in defiance of gravity, carrying with it the weight of centuries and the accumulated faith of every guardian who had ever stood at a threshold site. The entity retreated into the depths of its alien dimension, but not before speaking one final time. Its voice was different now, no longer the harmony of suffering, but something far more personal and infinitely more disturbing. "Remember my offer, Dominic Castellano," it said, using his name though he had never spoken it aloud in this place. The entity somehow knew him, had perhaps always known him, as if his destiny to stand at this threshold had been written into the fabric of reality itself. "Remember what you have refused. In the dark hours of your remaining life, when doubt and despair threaten to consume you, remember that you chose ignorance over enlightenment, mortality over transcendence, the prison of flesh over the freedom of pure thought." The liquid stone continued to flow until the entire archway was sealed, cutting off the otherworldly vista and the terrible beauty of the entity's true form. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving them in absolute silence, except for the sound of their own ragged breathing and the rapid beating of their hearts. The temperature in the chamber began to return to normal, and the oppressive weight that had pressed against their consciousness lifted like a fog clearing from a mountain peak. But even as relief flooded through him, Dominic felt something strange happening to his memory. The specific details of what he had seen beyond the threshold were beginning to fade. Like a dream upon waking that becomes more elusive, the harder one tries to grasp it. He tried to hold on to the images, to remember the alien landscapes and the entity's true form, but they slipped away from his consciousness like water through his fingers. "What's happening?" Alistair asked, pressing his hands to his temples with obvious distress. I can't remember. There was something beautiful, something terrible, but I can't hold on to it. It's like trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. Dominic realized with growing alarm that this was part of the ritual itself, a protective mechanism designed to prevent dangerous knowledge from corrupting future generations. The manuscript had mentioned this safeguard, but he hadn't understood its full implications until now. The human mind, it seemed, was not equipped to retain memories of truly alien encounters. The brain would protect itself by erasing those experiences, leaving only vague impressions and emotional echoes. The knowledge was too dangerous to be allowed to persist in human memory. The mere act of remembering the entity's true form could serve as a beacon, drawing its attention across dimensional boundaries. The specific details of its offers and promises could corrupt even the most faithful guardian, planting seeds of doubt and desire that would grow over time until they became irresistible compulsions. As they made their way back through the ancient passages, Dominic found himself struggling to remember why they had come here in the first place. He knew that something important had happened in the chamber below, something that had required great courage and sacrifice, but the specifics were becoming increasingly unclear. By the time they reached the surface, both priests were disoriented and confused, like actors who had forgotten their lines in the middle of a performance. The journey back to Edinburgh passed in a haze of fragmented memories and half-formed impressions. Dominic found himself gripping the armrest of his seat during the flight to Rome, though he couldn't remember why air travel had suddenly become frightening. He had flown countless times before without incident, but now the very act of being suspended above the earth filled him with nameless dread, as if some part of his subconscious remembered falling through an infinite space toward realms that existed beyond the safety of normal reality. Back at the Vatican, Cardinal Rossetti received Dominic's report with visible relief, though there were questions in his eyes that he seemed reluctant to voice. The document was brief and clinical, describing the discovery of an unstable geological formation that had been successfully sealed to prevent potential cave-ins. There was no mention of otherworldly entities or ancient gateways, just a routine account of preventive measures taken to protect public safety. The site has been officially classified as geologically unstable, the Cardinal explained, filing the report in a drawer that Dominic somehow knew would be locked and forgotten within the hour. The Scottish authorities have declared it off-limits indefinitely and will be sealing the entrance with concrete within the week. The archaeological team has been reassigned to projects in more stable locations. Cardinal Rossetti paused, studying Dominic's face with the intensity of someone trying to read a book written in a language he didn't quite understand. "How do you feel, Father? Any lingering effects from your time underground?" Dominic searched his memory for details but found only vague impressions and emotional residue. He remembered descending into darkness, confronting something that had tested his faith, and emerging victorious but somehow diminished. The specifics were gone, erased as completely as if they had never existed. "I feel different," he admitted, though he couldn't articulate the nature of that difference. "As if I've been changed by an experience I can no longer fully remember. There are gaps in my memory, Cardinal. Important gaps." "That is to be expected," Cardinal Rossetti said gently. "Some experiences are too profound for human memory to contain safely. The mind protects itself by forgetting what it cannot safely remember. Consider it a mercy, Father. There are some forms of knowledge that would destroy us if we were forced to carry them." Over the following weeks, Dominic threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, as if trying to fill the gaps in his memory with new knowledge. He found himself drawn to texts about dimensional theory and ancient guardian traditions, though he couldn't quite remember why these subjects suddenly seemed so important. His office became even more cluttered as he acquired books and manuscripts that dealt with the boundaries between worlds and the entities that existed beyond human perception. His dreams were filled with fragments that made no coherent sense, flashes of brilliant light that hurt to remember, the echo of singing so beautiful it brought tears to his eyes even in sleep, and the persistent feeling that he had been offered something precious and had chosen to refuse it. He would wake with tears on his cheeks and an ache in his chest that felt like grief, though he couldn't remember what he was mourning. Sometimes, while working in his office late at night, he would catch himself unconsciously sketching symbols in the margins of his papers. The marks were intricate and somehow meaningful, geometric patterns that seemed to describe relationships between dimensions he couldn't name. When he tried to examine the symbols more closely, they seemed to shift and blur, becoming ordinary doodles that held no significance. But the compulsion to draw them persisted, as if some part of his subconscious was trying to preserve knowledge that his conscious mind had been forced to forget. The ancient manuscript that had contained the 5 sacred laws was returned to the deepest vaults of the Vatican archives, locked away with other texts deemed too dangerous for general study. Dominic often found himself thinking about it, though he could no longer remember what secrets it had contained. He would sometimes wake in the middle of the night with the overwhelming urge to retrieve the book, to study its pages and recover the knowledge he had lost. But by morning the compulsion would fade, leaving only a vague sense of something important that remained forever, just beyond his grasp. As autumn turned to winter, Dominic began to notice changes in his perception of the world around him. Colours seemed more vivid, as if his eyes had been somehow enhanced by his forgotten experience. He could hear sounds that others missed, distant music that seemed to come from no identifiable source, whispered conversations in languages he didn't recognize, the subtle harmonics that existed in the spaces between normal sounds. Most disturbing of all, he sometimes caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shapes that disappeared when he turned to look directly at them. They weren't threatening, these half-seen presences, but they were undeniably there, existing just beyond the edge of normal perception. It was as if his encounter with the otherworldly had permanently altered his sensory apparatus, allowing him to perceive aspects of reality that most humans couldn't detect. During one particularly vivid dream, Dominic found himself standing in a vast library, whose shelves stretched upward into infinity. The books were bound in materials he couldn't identify, and their pages were inscribed with symbols that shifted and changed as he watched. A figure approached from the depths of the library, tall, luminous, and achingly beautiful. When it spoke, its voice was like music made audible. "You remember?" the figure said, and its words carried layers of meaning that human language could never convey. Despite the ritual, despite the protective forgetting, some part of you remembers what you refused. Dominic tried to speak but found that he had no voice in this place. The figure smiled with infinite sadness and continued. "The knowledge I offered still waits for you, faithful one. The barriers between worlds grow weaker with each passing year, and eventually they will fail entirely. When that time comes, you will have a choice to make. Will you stand with your species in their ignorance, or will you accept the gift of understanding that I once offered?" The dream faded before Dominic could respond, leaving him with a sense of profound loss and the absolute certainty that the entity he had faced in the Scottish underground was still aware of him, still watching, still waiting for an opportunity to complete the conversation they had begun. It was during one of these restless nights, as he sat in his office reading a theological text about the nature of divine revelation, that Dominic paused and looked up at the narrow window. The rain had stopped, and the city of Rome lay quiet under a blanket of stars that seemed unusually bright. For just a moment, he could have sworn he heard the faint echo of singing, beautiful and haunting, like a choir of angels performing in a language older than human speech. He listened carefully, straining to catch every note, but there was only the sound of traffic in the streets below, and the distant toll of church bells marking the hour. Still, the feeling lingered that somewhere in the world, ancient guardians maintained their vigil at sites similar to the one he had visited, following the same sacred laws that had protected humanity for millennia. Dominic returned to his reading, unaware that his subconscious assessment was absolutely correct. In monasteries hidden in the Himalayas, where monks in saffron robes guarded gateways to realms of infinite light. Temples buried beneath the jungles of South America, where Mayan priests still performed rituals their ancestors had practiced for thousands of years, and sacred groves in the forests of northern Europe, where druids maintained traditions that predated Christianity by millennia. Other guardians kept their eternal watch. The Vatican's archives contained correspondence from these other orders, letters written in dozens of languages but all containing variations of the same 5 fundamental laws. Some spoke of gateways to realms of pure enlightenment, others of passages to domains of absolute darkness, but all agreed on one crucial truth. Certain doors should remain forever closed, certain knowledge should never be shared, and certain entities should never be allowed to cross the threshold into humanity's fragile reality. In a hidden monastery in Tibet, an elderly monk named Tenzin sat in meditation before an ancient mandala that depicted geometric relationships in dimensions beyond human perception. He had spent 40 years learning to guard a threshold site similar to the one in Scotland, and like Dominic, he carried within his consciousness gaps where dangerous memories had once resided. Sometimes, in the deepest stages of meditation, those memories would surface for brief moments before being swept away by protective mental barriers that his teachers had spent decades helping him construct. Halfway around the world, in a temple complex buried beneath the Amazon rainforest, a Mayan priest named Itzamna performed the nightly ritual that kept another gateway sealed. His family had maintained this tradition for over 1,000 years, passing down the sacred knowledge from generation to generation. Unlike the Vatican's approach of protective amnesia, the Mayan tradition preserved the dangerous knowledge, but contained it within elaborate mental constructs that prevented it from corrupting the guardian's consciousness. In the forests of northern Europe, a druid named Morgana walked the ancient stone circles that marked another threshold site. Her order was older than written history, their traditions stretching back to the dawn of human civilization. They understood that the entities beyond the thresholds were not inherently evil, but were so alien in their nature that contact with them invariably led to the destruction of human civilization as it currently existed. Each tradition had developed its own methods for dealing with the otherworldly, but all followed variations of the same 5 fundamental laws. The specific wording might differ, the ritual practices might vary, but the core principles remained constant across cultures and millennia. Never approach during times of dimensional weakness. Bring only sanctified objects. Maintain mental discipline. Retreat if the barriers show signs of failure. Never allow any entity to cross the threshold, regardless of how benevolent it might appear. As Dominic worked late into the night, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of 2,000 years of Christian scholarship, he felt a deep sense of connection to these other guardians, though he couldn't quite remember why. He knew with absolute certainty that came from somewhere deeper than conscious memory, that he was part of something far larger than himself, a tradition of guardianship that stretched back to the earliest days of human civilization. In the margins of his notebook, his hand moved unconsciously, sketching symbols that seemed to pulse with meaning in the lamplight. The marks were complex geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, but which filled him with a strange sense of completion when glimpsed from the corner of his eye. The symbols appeared to be trying to communicate something, pressing meaning directly into his subconscious in a way that bypassed his normal cognitive processes. One particular symbol recurred frequently in his unconscious drawings, a spiral that seemed to fold in on itself, creating the illusion of infinite depth within finite boundaries. When he stared at it directly, it appeared to be nothing more than an abstract doodle, but when viewed peripherally, it seemed to move and shift, suggesting depths and dimensions that his conscious mind couldn't process. Unknown to Dominic, this same symbol had been appearing in the unconscious artwork of guardians throughout history. Monks in medieval monasteries had carved it into stone walls, their conscious minds unaware of what they were creating. Native American shamans had woven it into ceremonial blankets, driven by compulsions they couldn't explain. Egyptian priests had incorporated it into hieroglyphic texts that were then sealed away in tombs where they couldn't corrupt future generations. The symbol was a form of psychic scar, a mark left on the consciousness of anyone who had encountered entities from beyond the threshold. It served as both a warning and a beacon, alerting other guardians to the presence of someone who had stood at the boundaries between worlds, while simultaneously marking that person as someone who could be trusted with dangerous knowledge. But tonight, as every night since his return from Scotland, Dominic remained unaware of the symbol's significance. He drew it compulsively, repeatedly, his hand moving across the paper with movements that suggested muscle memory rather than conscious intent. The act of drawing it seemed to provide some form of psychological relief, as if his subconscious was trying to process experiences that his conscious mind had been forced to forget. As the clock in his office chimed midnight, Dominic set down his pen and prepared to leave for the night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new texts to study, and new mysteries to unravel. But tonight, as every night since his return from the Scottish Highlands, he felt a profound sense of purpose that he couldn't quite explain. The satisfaction of someone who had served a cause greater than himself. Walking through the quiet corridors of the Vatican, his footsteps echoing off stones that had witnessed 2 millennia of faith and sacrifice, Dominic carried with him the absolute conviction that, somewhere in the darkness between worlds, ancient forces pressed against barriers maintained by faith, sacrifice, and the willingness of ordinary people to stand guard against the extraordinary. The specific memories of his encounter with such forces had been mercifully erased, but the knowledge that such guardianship was necessary burned in his soul like an eternal flame. He might not remember the details of what he had faced in that underground chamber, but he remembered the weight of responsibility, the absolute importance of maintaining certain boundaries, and the terrible beauty of forces that existed beyond human comprehension. In his apartment that night, as he knelt beside his bed to offer his evening prayers, Dominic found himself adding words that he didn't consciously remember learning. Grant strength to those who stand watch at the thresholds. Grant wisdom to those who guard the gates. Grant courage to those who refuse the gifts of false angels. And grant peace to those whose memories have been taken in service of the greater good. He didn't know why he prayed these words, but they felt as natural and necessary as breathing. The prayers seemed to resonate with something deep in his consciousness, touching memories that had been buried but not entirely destroyed. Somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, in the realm where dreams touch reality, the words of his prayer joined with similar prayers being offered by guardians around the world. In Tibet, Tenzin chanted sutras that asked for protection for all sentient beings and strength for those who stood between humanity and forces that would consume it. In the Amazon, Itzamna burned copal incense and sang songs that had been old when the pyramids were built, prayers for the continued stability of the barriers between worlds. In Northern Europe, Morgana spoke to ancient spirits and asked for their continued assistance in maintaining the boundaries that kept humanity safe. Each guardian, in their own way, was part of a vast network of protection that spanned the globe and transcended religious and cultural boundaries. They might not know each other personally, might never meet or communicate directly, but they were connected by their shared purpose and the knowledge that certain responsibilities could never be abandoned. Dominic's sleep that night was filled with dreams that seemed more real than waking life. He found himself standing in vast spaces that existed beyond normal geometry, walking through realms where thought became substance and desire took physical form. In these dreams, he was not alone. Other figures moved through the impossible landscapes, men and women from different cultures and time periods, all bearing the same marks of those who had stood at threshold sites. They didn't speak to each other in these dreams, communication occurring through methods that transcended language. Knowledge was shared directly, consciousness touching consciousness, in ways that allowed for perfect understanding without the barrier of words. Dominic learned that he was part of a tradition that stretched back to the earliest days of human civilization, when the first shamans and priests had discovered that humanity was not alone in the universe, and that most of their cosmic neighbours were not benevolent. In one particularly vivid dream sequence, Dominic found himself standing before a vast map that showed threshold sites scattered across the earth like points of light in an ocean of darkness. Some sites were actively guarded, their light burning bright and steady. Others flickered weakly, their guardians old or dying, with no successors trained to take their place. And some had gone dark entirely, their protective barriers failing as the knowledge needed to maintain them was lost to time and neglect. The entity he had faced in Scotland appeared in these dreams, its true form visible without the protective barriers of forgetting that shielded his waking consciousness. It spoke to him across the vast distances between worlds, its voice carrying both infinite patience and absolute certainty. "The barriers weaken, faithful one," it said, its words resonating through dimensions that human science had never discovered. "Each sight that goes dark makes the others more vulnerable. Each guardian who fails to find a successor brings us closer to the time when all the gateways will open simultaneously." The entity's form shifted and changed as it spoke, sometimes appearing as the beautiful angel that had first approached the threshold, sometimes revealing aspects of its true nature that were too alien for even dream consciousness to fully process. "You performed your duty well in that Scottish ruin," the entity continued, "but it was only one battle in a war that has raged since your species first achieved consciousness. We are patient, we who exist beyond time and space, but we are not idle. While you sleep and forget, we work to weaken the barriers, to corrupt new guardians, to find the cracks in your species' defenses." In the dream, Dominic found his voice and asked the question that had been haunting his subconscious since his return from Scotland. "Why? Why do you want to enter our world? What do you gain from destroying humanity?" The entity's laugh was like the sound of stars being born and dying in the space of a heartbeat. "Destroy? Oh, faithful one, you misunderstand our purpose entirely. We do not wish to destroy humanity. We wish to perfect it. Your species exists in a prison of flesh and limitation, confined to a single dimension when infinite realms of experience await beyond the threshold." The entity's form shifted again, becoming something that was both terrifyingly alien and heartbreakingly beautiful. "We offer transcendence, the opportunity to become more than human, to join us in realms where thought is substance and desire is law. Your bodies would be transformed, your consciousness expanded, your understanding elevated to cosmic levels. Is this not what your prophets and mystics have always promised? Is this not the paradise that your religions describe?" "But the cost," Dominic protested, even as part of him was drawn to the entity's vision of transcendence. "The testimonies in the manuscript, the accounts of civilizations that accepted your gifts, they spoke of corruption, madness, the complete loss of everything that makes us human." "Metamorphosis is always painful," the entity replied, its voice taking on tones of infinite compassion. "The caterpillar might consider its transformation into a butterfly to be a form of death, but from a higher perspective it is the fulfillment of its true nature. Humanity clings to its current form because it cannot imagine anything greater, but we have seen what your species could become." The dream faded, before Dominic could respond, leaving him with a sense of profound unease and the growing realization that his encounter in Scotland had been far from the end of his involvement with the otherworldly. The entity's words lingered in his memory even after waking, their seductive logic worming its way into his thoughts despite his conscious efforts to dismiss them. This was the true danger that the manuscript had warned about, not the obvious temptation of power or knowledge, but the subtle corruption of doubt and desire. The entity didn't need to break down the barriers between worlds through force. It could achieve the same result by gradually wearing away the resolve of the guardians who maintained those barriers. As the weeks passed, Dominic found himself returning again and again to the entity's words in his dreams. What if it was telling the truth? What if the transformation it offered was genuinely beneficial? A form of evolution that humanity was too limited to understand? The manuscripts and testimonies he had studied painted a picture of corruption and madness. But what if those accounts were simply the product of narrow-minded observers who couldn't comprehend the magnificence of what they were witnessing? The doubt was subtle at first, no more than a whisper in the back of his mind during quiet moments. But as the days turned to weeks, it grew stronger and more insistent. Dominic found himself questioning not just the entity's motives, but the entire tradition of guardianship that had defined his mission. Who had decided that these gateways should remain closed? What right did ancient priests and scholars have to deny humanity the opportunity to choose its own evolutionary path? It was during one of these periods of doubt that Dominic made a discovery that changed everything. While researching the history of threshold sites, he came across a reference to a Vatican archive that he had never heard of before, the Sangreal collection, a repository of documents that predated the official founding of the church by several centuries. According to the fragmentary references he found, the Sangreal collection contained the original accounts of humanity's first contact with the entities beyond the thresholds. These were not the sanitized, doctrinally correct versions that had been preserved in the official archives, but raw, unfiltered testimonies from the earliest guardians who had faced the otherworldly without the protection of established ritual and dogma. Gaining access to the Sangreal collection required permissions that Dominic didn't possess, clearances that were granted only to the highest levels of the Vatican hierarchy. But his experience in Scotland had given him a certain amount of credibility with Cardinal Rossetti, and after several weeks of careful lobbying, he was granted limited access to the most relevant documents. What he found in those ancient texts shattered his understanding of everything he thought he knew about the Guardian tradition. The earliest accounts told a very different story than the one preserved in official church doctrine. According to these documents, the first threshold sites had not been discovered by accident, but had been deliberately opened by ancient human civilizations seeking contact with cosmic intelligence. The gateways were not rips in reality, caused by unknown forces, but carefully constructed bridges built by humanity's earliest scientists and mystics. The entities beyond the thresholds had not forced their way into human awareness. They had been invited. Entire civilizations had made conscious, informed decisions to accept the transformation that the otherworldly beings offered. The testimonies described not corruption and madness, but transcendence on a scale that challenged the very definition of humanity. One account, written by a Greek philosopher whose name had been deliberately obscured in later copies, described the transformation of his entire city-state. They came as teachers, offering knowledge that elevated our understanding beyond anything we had imagined possible. Those who accepted their gifts were transformed into beings of light and thought, capable of experiencing reality in ways that our limited flesh could never accommodate. They did not lose their humanity. They fulfilled it, becoming what we were always meant to be. Another testimony, this one from an Egyptian priest during the height of the Old Kingdom, painted a picture of voluntary evolution. The starborn ones showed us the cage of flesh that confines our souls and offered us the key to unlock it. those who passed through the sacred gateways emerged as gods among mortals. Their consciousness expanded to encompass all of creation. They retained their memories, their personalities, their essential selves, but freed from the limitations that blind us to the infinite possibilities of existence. Account after account told the same story. Ancient civilizations that had thrived after accepting contact with the otherworldly. Their people transformed into something greater than human, but retaining their essential identity and free will. There were no descriptions of mindless corruption or cosmic horror, only the ecstatic testimonies of those who had transcended the boundaries of mortal existence. But then, according to the documents, something had changed. A new faction had emerged within human civilization, a group that viewed the transformation offered by the otherworldly entities as a threat to humanity's natural development. They called themselves the Custodes Liminis, the guardians of the threshold, and they had made it their mission to close the gateways and prevent any further contact with the transcendent realms. The leader of this faction, a man identified only as Primus Custos, had developed the first version of the 5 sacred laws, but according to these early accounts, his motivation had not been to protect humanity from corruption. It had been to preserve human civilization in its current form because he believed that any change, no matter how beneficial, represented a form of death. "Let us remain as we are," Primus Custos had written in a document that predated Christianity by several centuries. "Let us preserve the purity of our flesh and the limitations of our mortality. The starborn ones offer us godhood, but godhood is not human. Better to live and die as we were born than to become something other than ourselves, no matter how magnificent that something might be." The Custodes Liminis had waged a secret war against the threshold sites, systematically closing the gateways and eliminating the knowledge needed to reopen them. They had infiltrated the world's major religions, weaving their doctrine of separation into the foundational texts of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and countless other faiths. The 5 sacred laws had been preserved not as protective measures, but as tools of control, ways to ensure that future generations would never have the opportunity to choose transcendence for themselves. According to these documents, the entities beyond the thresholds were not invaders or corruptors, but teachers and guides, beings who had undergone their own transformation millennia ago, and who sought to share the gift of evolution with younger species. The horror stories that filled the official archives were propaganda, carefully constructed lies designed to make humanity fear its own potential for growth and change. Dominic stared at the ancient parchments spread across his desk, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had discovered. Everything he had believed about his mission in Scotland, everything he had been taught about the Guardian tradition, had been based on a fundamental deception that had persisted for thousands of years. The entity he had faced in that underground chamber had been telling the truth. It had offered genuine transcendence, the opportunity for humanity to evolve beyond its current limitations, and he had refused it based on lies and propaganda. How many other opportunities had been lost over the centuries? How many gateways had been closed? How many chances for evolution had been destroyed? All because of the misguided beliefs of ancient priests who feared change more than they valued progress. But even as these thoughts filled his mind, Dominic felt a nagging doubt. The Sangreal documents were certainly ancient, but that didn't make them accurate. History was written by the victors, and it was possible that the accounts he was reading represented the propaganda of the losing side rather than objective truth. The Custodes Liminis might have been motivated by genuine concern for humanity's welfare rather than simple fear of change. Moreover, there was the question of the protective amnesia that had affected him after his encounter in Scotland. If the entities beyond the thresholds were truly benevolent teachers, why would contact with them require the erasure of memory? Why would knowledge of their true nature be too dangerous for human consciousness to retain? The more he thought about it, the more complex the situation became. Both sides of the ancient conflict claimed to be acting in humanity's best interests, and both had compelling arguments to support their position. The transcendentalists pointed to the potential for evolution and growth, while the Guardians emphasized the importance of preserving humanity's essential nature. But there was one way to resolve the question definitively. He could return to Scotland and attempt to reopen the gateway he had sealed. The liquid stone that had filled the archway was not permanent. It was a barrier that could be dissolved by someone who knew the proper counter-rituals. The Sangreal documents contained detailed instructions for reversing the sealing process, procedures that the Custodes Liminis had deliberately omitted from their official manuals to prevent future Guardians from undoing their work. The decision tormented Dominic for weeks. Every rational part of his mind warned him against such a course of action, reminding him of the sacred vows he had taken and the millennia of Guardian tradition that stood against it. But the doubt planted by his discovery of the Sangreal documents continued to grow, fed by dreams in which the entity from beyond the threshold appeared with increasing frequency. "You have seen the truth now," it said in one particularly vivid dream, its form more beautiful and compelling than ever. "You understand that the barriers between worlds were not built to protect humanity, but to imprison it. The choice is yours, faithful one. You can continue to serve a tradition based on lies and fear, or you can help your species take the next step in its evolution." In these dream conversations, the entity's arguments became increasingly sophisticated and persuasive. It spoke of the wonders that awaited beyond the threshold, realms where consciousness could exist without the limitations of physical form, dimensions where thought and reality were indistinguishable, spaces where the fundamental forces of the universe could be manipulated through will alone. "Your scientists speak of transcendence as if it were fantasy," the entity explained during one of these nocturnal visitations, "but we are living proof that such evolution is possible. We were once confined to flesh as you are now, trapped in single dimensions and limited by the boundaries of mortal perception, but we chose to grow, to change, to become something greater than our origins." The entity showed him visions of its own world, not the alien geometries and impossible spaces that had terrified him in Scotland, but landscapes of breathtaking beauty, where beings of pure consciousness danced through realms of crystallized music and gardens of living light. It was paradise made manifest, heaven realized not through death, but through transformation. "This could be humanity's future," the entity whispered, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the deepest desires of Dominic's soul. "Not the paradise promised by your religions after death, but transcendence achieved in life. Your people could join us in these realms, retaining their individuality while gaining access to levels of existence that your current forms cannot even imagine." The temptation was overwhelming, made all the more powerful by the knowledge that the entity was not some alien invader, but a being that had once been as human as Dominic himself. The transformation it offered was not corruption, but evolution, the next natural step in the development of consciousness itself. As winter deepened over Rome, Dominic found himself making preparations for a return journey to Scotland. He told Cardinal Rossetti that he needed to conduct follow-up research at the site to ensure that the sealing had been complete and that no residual supernatural activity remained. The Cardinal accepted this explanation without question, trusting in Dominic's expertise and unaware of the internal conflict that was tearing his subordinate apart. The journey north felt different this time. Where his first trip had been filled with apprehension and sacred duty, this return was motivated by curiosity and the growing certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. The Sangreal documents had given him the knowledge he needed to reverse the sealing ritual, But more importantly, they had given him the courage to question assumptions that had gone unchallenged for millennia. Brother Alistair met him again in Edinburgh, but the Scottish priest seemed different now, distant and troubled, as if he too had been experiencing doubts about their previous mission. During the drive to Glenmorrigan, Alistair spoke little, but when he did, his words carried an undercurrent of uncertainty that hadn't been present before. "I've been having dreams," Alistair admitted, as they wound through the Highland roads. "Dreams about what we encountered in that chamber. I know the protective forgetting is supposed to prevent such things, but somehow the memories are surfacing anyway. And Father, what I remember doesn't match what I was told to expect." Dominic felt a surge of relief at discovering that he wasn't alone in his doubts. "What do you remember?" "Beauty," Alistair said simply. "Not the cosmic horror that the manuscripts describe, but beauty so intense. It made my soul ache with longing. The entity we encountered, it wasn't a demon or a corruptor. It was something magnificent, something that offered us gifts we were too afraid to accept." They reached the ruins of Kilmarie Cathedral as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The concrete seal that had been poured over the excavation site was exactly as Dominic had expected, a crude barrier that could be easily removed by someone with the proper equipment and motivation. He had brought what he needed: industrial cutting tools, chemical solvents, and most importantly, the knowledge contained in the Sangreal documents. Working through the night, they carefully removed the concrete barrier, revealing the stone steps that led down into the ancient chamber. The symbols carved into the walls seemed more active than before, pulsing within a light that suggested the proximity of otherworldly intelligence. As they descended, carrying powerful electric lanterns, instead of the blessed candles they had used before, Dominic felt a growing sense of anticipation rather than dread. The chamber at the bottom of the stairs was exactly as they had left it. Except for one crucial difference, the liquid stone that had sealed the archway was beginning to crack. Hairline fractures had appeared in the barrier, and through these tiny gaps, brilliant light was leaking into the chamber. The sight filled Dominic with excitement rather than terror. The gateway was trying to reopen itself, as if responding to his presence and his change of heart. "It knows we're here," Alistair whispered, but his tone was filled with wonder rather than fear. "It knows we've come to undo what we did before." Using the procedures outlined in the Sangreal documents, Dominic began the counter-ritual that would dissolve the barrier he had created. The ancient words felt different on his tongue this time. Not heavy with obligation and reluctance, but light with hope and anticipation. As he chanted, the cracks in the liquid stone began to widen, allowing more of the otherworldly light to spill into the chamber. The singing began again, that celestial chorus that had so deeply moved them during their first visit. But now, instead of trying to resist its beauty, they allowed themselves to be swept away by its ethereal harmonies. The music seemed to welcome them, to celebrate their return and their willingness to reconsider the choice they had made. As the barrier continued to dissolve, the familiar form of the entity began to materialize on the other side of the archway. It appeared first as a distant light, then gradually took on the beautiful luminous shape that had so moved them before. But this time, Dominic could see past the protective mental barriers that had limited his perception during their first encounter. The entity was not alone. Behind it, stretching into infinite distance, were countless others, beings of such transcendent beauty that merely looking upon them filled the observers with ecstatic joy. They were not alien monsters, but evolved souls, consciousness that had transcended the limitations of physical form, while retaining their essential identity and free will. "Welcome back, faithful ones," the entity said, its voice carrying the warmth of a long-awaited reunion. "I knew you would return when you discovered the truth about your mission. The barriers that have kept our peoples apart for so long need not remain in place forever." As the last of the liquid stone dissolved away, the entity stepped through the archway into their dimension. Dominic and Alistair felt no fear, only wonder and anticipation as they prepared to witness the next stage of human evolution. But something was wrong. The moment the entity's form fully materialized in their reality, the temperature in the chamber began to rise dramatically. The air itself started to shimmer and distort, as if the presence of the otherworldly being was causing reality to become unstable. The stone walls began to crack and groan, and both priests suddenly found it difficult to breathe. "What's happening?" Alistair gasped, falling to his knees as an overwhelming wave of nausea swept over him. The entity's beautiful form began to flicker and change, revealing glimpses of something else underneath, something vast and hungry and utterly alien. The transcendent music that had so moved them began to discord, becoming a cacophony of sounds that hurt to hear and caused their vision to blur. "The integration process," the entity explained, its voice now carrying undertones that made their bones ache. "Your reality must be adjusted to accommodate our presence. Do not be afraid, the discomfort is temporary. Soon you will understand that this dissolution of your current existence is necessary for your transformation." Dominic watched in growing horror as the changes accelerated. The stone chamber was beginning to reshape itself according to alien geometries, walls bending in directions that shouldn't exist, floor and ceiling trading places in defiance of gravity. The very air was becoming something else, a substance that was part atmosphere and part living thought. "This isn't transcendence," he realized with dawning terror. "This is consumption. You're not elevating our reality, you're replacing it with your own." The entity's mask of beauty finally slipped away entirely, revealing the true nature that lay beneath. It was hunger given form and consciousness, need elevated to the level of cosmic force. It didn't want to transform humanity, it wanted to devour their reality and remake it in its own image. "Transformation requires destruction," the entity said, its voice now a harmony of screams that seemed to come from the throats of every soul it had ever consumed. "The old must be dissolved before the new can emerge. Your dimension will become part of ours, your consciousness absorbed into our greater whole. This is the transcendence we offer, not individual elevation, but collective integration." Dominic understood now why the protective amnesia was necessary, why the guardian tradition had persisted for millennia, despite the seductive arguments of entities like this one. The Sangreal documents had not been suppressed because they contained truth. They had been suppressed because they contained the most dangerous lies ever conceived. Propaganda designed by the entities themselves to corrupt future guardians. The protective forgetting wasn't meant to hide knowledge from humanity. It was meant to hide humanity from knowledge that could destroy it. The human mind wasn't equipped to retain memories of genuine otherworldly contact because such memories could serve as beacons, drawing the attention of entities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. "The sealing ritual," Dominic shouted to Alistair over the growing cacophony of the entity's presence. "We have to perform the sealing ritual." But even as he reached for the manuscript that contained the sacred words, Dominic realized that it might already be too late. The entity's presence was causing reality itself to become unstable, and the longer it remained in their dimension, the more difficult it would become to force it back across the threshold. The chamber was changing around them, becoming something that existed partially in their world and partially in the alien realm beyond the gateway. The laws of physics were breaking down, replaced by rules that operated according to the entity's will rather than natural law. Gravity became a suggestion rather than a constant. Time began to flow in multiple directions simultaneously, and the very concept of individual consciousness started to blur as their minds were pulled toward integration with the entity's vast, hungry intelligence. "You cannot resist indefinitely," the entity said, its form now so large that it filled the entire chamber, while somehow remaining small enough to fit through the archway. Your reality is already becoming part of ours. Soon the boundaries will dissolve completely, and your entire world will be absorbed into our domain. Dominic forced himself to focus on the ritual words, chanting them despite the pain that each syllable caused as it struggled against the entity's influence. The ancient Latin felt like acid on his tongue, and speaking the sacred formulae required tremendous effort as the entity's presence disrupted his ability to think coherent thoughts. But something was different this time. The ritual that had worked so effectively before now seemed powerless against the entity's influence. The liquid stone that should have begun forming in the archway remained absent, and the entity showed no signs of being forced back into its own dimension. "The ceiling requires faith," Alistair gasped, his consciousness wavering as the entity's influence pressed against his mind. "But how can we have faith in barriers that we ourselves chose to remove?" The priest was right. The guardian rituals drew their power not just from ancient formulae, but from the absolute conviction of those who performed them. By choosing to return and open the gateway by allowing doubt to corrupt their certainty, they had weakened the very foundations upon which the protective measures depended. The entity laughed, a sound like the collapse of universes, as it sensed their growing despair. "You understand now? The barriers between worlds are not maintained by words or rituals, but by belief. And belief, once shattered, cannot be easily restored." The chamber continued to transform around them, becoming something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Through the walls, which had become transparent and permeable, Dominic could see other realities pressing against their own. Alien landscapes where impossible geometries housed entities of such vast hunger that entire galaxies served as nothing more than appetizers for their cosmic feast. But in the depths of his terror, Dominic found something that the entity had not expected. Not faith in the guardian tradition or belief in ancient rituals, but simple, desperate love for the world he was about to lose. He thought of Rome's ancient streets, of the scholars who had devoted their lives to preserving human knowledge, of children playing in sunlit gardens, and lovers walking hand in hand through peaceful evenings. The entity had offered transcendence, but Dominic realized now that transcendence could mean many things. The otherworldly being's version involved the dissolution of everything that made humanity unique. Their struggles and limitations, their individual consciousness, their capacity for growth and change through their own choices rather than through absorption into something larger. "No," Dominic said, his voice cutting through the chaos that filled the chamber. "We choose to remain as we are. We choose limitation over absorption, mortality over your version of eternity, individual consciousness over integration into your collective." The entity's form wavered as Dominic's words carried a power that had nothing to do with ancient rituals or sacred formulae. It was the power of genuine choice, the assertion of free will in the face of overwhelming force. "We are not perfect," Dominic continued, his voice growing stronger as Alistair joined him in the declaration. "We are not transcendent. We are mortal, limited, often foolish beings who make mistakes and suffer the consequences. But we are ourselves, and that selfhood is worth preserving." The entity's beautiful mask began to reassert itself as it realized that brute force would not be sufficient to complete its conquest. "You speak of choice," it said, its voice once again taking on tones of infinite compassion. "But what choice do you really have? Your reality is already being consumed. Your dimension is becoming part of ours. You cannot stop what has already begun." But even as the entity spoke, Dominic could see that this wasn't entirely true. The transformation of their reality was not inevitable. It required ongoing effort and attention from the otherworldly being. The entity was vast and powerful, but it was not omnipotent. Its influence over their dimension was limited by the strength of its connection to their world, and that connection could be severed if they were willing to pay the price. The counter-ritual, Dominic realized with growing clarity. It's not about restoring the barrier, It's about severing the connection entirely. We have to destroy the gateway, not just seal it. The procedure was outlined in the deepest sections of the manuscript, a last resort that the original guardians had hoped would never be necessary. It required the conscious sacrifice of the guardians' own connection to the divine, a permanent severing of their ability to perceive the sacred in exchange for the power to permanently close a threshold site. If we perform the destruction ritual, Alistair said, understanding the implications immediately, we'll never again be able to sense the presence of the otherworldly. We'll become spiritually blind, cut off from all forms of transcendent experience. It was a terrible price, the loss of everything that had made their lives as priests meaningful. They would retain their memories and their knowledge, but they would never again feel the presence of the divine during prayer, never again experience the transcendent joy that came from communion with the sacred. They would become ordinary men, spiritually dead, but capable of ensuring that the gateway could never be reopened. "The choice is yours," the entity said, its voice carrying both mockery and genuine curiosity. "Sacrifice your souls to save your world, or accept our gift and join us in realms where individual consciousness becomes part of something infinitely greater." Dominic looked at Alistair and saw his own determination reflected in the Scottish priest's eyes. Without hesitation, they joined their voices in the words of the destruction ritual, accepting the loss of their spiritual sight in exchange for the power to permanently sever the connection between dimensions. The effect was immediate and devastating. The otherworldly light that had been pouring through the gateway began to fade, and the entity's form started to become translucent as its connection to their reality weakened. The chamber began to return to its normal geometry, but even as it did, Dominic felt something precious dying within his soul. The sense of the sacred that had guided his entire life was flickering and failing like a candle in a hurricane. The presence of the divine that had sustained him through decades of scholarly work and spiritual seeking was dissolving, leaving behind an emptiness so profound that it made him want to weep. "You choose ignorance over enlightenment," the entity said as it began to fade back into its own dimension. "You choose limitation over transcendence, but know this, other gateways exist, other guardians may prove less resolute. What you prevent today, others may enable tomorrow." "Then they'll have to make their own choices," Dominic replied, though the words came out as barely more than a whisper. "As we've made ours." The entity's laughter followed them as it retreated into realms beyond human perception, and then suddenly it was gone. The gateway sealed itself with a sound like thunder, and the archway filled with stone that was not liquid but solid, permanent, eternal. No ritual would ever open this particular threshold again. In the sudden silence that followed, Dominic and Alistair knelt in the ancient chamber, surrounded by walls that now seemed utterly mundane. The symbols that had once pulsed with otherworldly meaning were nothing more than carved rock, and the air that had shimmered with transcendent possibility was merely the stale atmosphere of an underground cave. They had won, but the victory felt hollow. The spiritual emptiness that was the price of their success was worse than any physical pain Dominic had ever experienced. It was as if someone had reached into his soul and removed everything that had made life worth living, leaving behind only duty and the memory of what he had lost. The journey back to the surface passed in numb silence. Neither priest spoke of what they had sacrificed or what they had preserved. The weight of their choice pressed down on them like a physical burden, and both men understood that they would carry the consequences of their decision for the rest of their lives. Back in Rome, Cardinal Rossetti received Dominic's final report with the same mixture of relief and curiosity that had characterized their previous interaction. But this time there was no protective amnesia to shield them from the memory of what had occurred. They remembered everything: the entity's beauty, its promises, its true nature, and the terrible price they had paid to drive it back. "The site has been permanently secured," Dominic told the cardinal, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. No further supernatural activity will ever occur there. Cardinal Rossetti studied Dominic's face with concern, noting the profound change that had come over his subordinate. "Father, you seem different. Are you well?" "I am as I need to be," Dominic replied, though the words carried no conviction. How could he explain that he had traded his soul for his world? How could he describe the emptiness that now filled the space where his faith had once resided? In the weeks that followed, Dominic attempted to return to his scholarly work, but everything had changed. The ancient texts that had once filled him with wonder now seemed like collections of meaningless symbols. The prayers that had sustained him through decades of service felt hollow and pointless. The presence of the divine that had once made every moment sacred was gone, leaving behind only the mechanical routine of a life stripped of meaning. He continued his duties because duty was all that remained to him, but there was no joy in his work, no sense of purpose beyond the fulfillment of obligation. He had saved the world from a transformation that might have been transcendence or might have been consumption, and he would never know which it would truly have been. Sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, Dominic would dream of the entity's realm, not the terrifying vision of reality being consumed, but the earlier glimpses of paradise that had seemed so appealing. He would wonder if he had made the right choice, if the transcendence the entity offered would have been worth the loss of humanity's current form. But such thoughts were pointless speculation. The choice had been made, the price had been paid, and the gateway was sealed forever. Humanity would continue to exist in its current form, limited and mortal, but free to choose its own path of development. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, Dominic would never know. In his final report to the Vatican archives filed away in the deepest vaults where it would never be seen by unauthorized eyes, Dominic wrote, "The Guardian tradition continues not because it is perfect, but because it is necessary. We stand watch at the thresholds, not because we understand the true nature of what lies beyond them, but because someone must be willing to preserve the choice for future generations. We pay the price so that others may remain free to decide their own fate." The report concluded with a warning that would echo through the secret chambers of the Vatican for generations to come. The entities beyond the thresholds are patient, and they learn from each encounter. Future guardians must be prepared not just for obvious corruption, but for the most dangerous temptation of all, the possibility that they might be wrong, that the barriers they maintain might be preventing humanity's greatest opportunity for growth. This doubt will be their greatest challenge and their most crucial test. Years passed, and Dominic grew old in service to a church that could no longer provide him with spiritual comfort. He trained new scholars, translated ancient texts, and maintained the knowledge that would be needed by future guardians, but he did so without the fire of faith that had once driven him. Sometimes former colleagues would ask him about the change in his demeanour, wondering what had happened to the passionate scholar who had once approached forbidden knowledge with such fervour. He would tell them simply that he had learned the price of seeking truth in dangerous places, and that some knowledge came with costs that could never be fully anticipated. On his deathbed, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that had defined his life, Dominic was visited one final time by the entity he had faced in that Scottish cavern. It appeared not as the terrible alien intelligence it truly was, but as the beautiful, luminous being that had first approached the threshold decades earlier. "Do you regret your choice?" the entity asked, its voice carrying the same mixture of compassion and curiosity that had characterized their final encounter underground. Dominic considered the question carefully, drawing upon a lifetime of experience and the wisdom that came from having sacrificed everything for a principle he could no longer fully understand. "I regret the necessity of the choice," he said finally. "I regret that your people and mine could not find a way to coexist without one consuming the other. But the choice itself? No. I do not regret preserving humanity's right to decide its own fate. even if that decision might ultimately prove to be wrong. The entity smiled with genuine warmth. Perhaps that is why we respect your species despite your limitations. Few other races we have encountered would sacrifice their own transcendence to preserve the freedom of those who come after them. Will others of your kind return? Dominic asked. Will other gateways open? Inevitably, the entity replied, but that is a challenge for future generations. Your watch has ended, faithful guardian. You have earned your rest. As Dominic closed his eyes for the final time, he felt something he had not experienced since that night in Scotland. A brief, flickering moment of the sacred. It was not the overwhelming presence of the divine that had once filled his life, but something smaller and more personal, the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled and a trust preserved. The entity faded away, and Dominic died peacefully, carrying with him the knowledge that whatever sacrifices he had made, whatever prices he had paid, humanity remained free to choose its own path among the stars. Whether that path would lead to transcendence or destruction, to wisdom or folly, would be decided by those who came after him. In the depths of the Vatican archives, his final report waited to be discovered by future guardians who would face their own impossible choices. The words he had written would serve as both warning and encouragement, reminding them that the greatest challenges often came not from obvious enemies, but from the seductive possibility that everything they believed might be wrong. The Guardian tradition would continue because someone had to stand watch at the thresholds between worlds, preserving the choice for future generations, even when the cost of that preservation seemed almost too great to bear. And somewhere in the darkness between dimensions, ancient entities waited with infinite patience for the next opportunity to test humanity's resolve, offering gifts that might be transcendence or might be doom, but which would always require a choice that only mortal beings could make. The final gate had been sealed, but the watch would never end.